Good Sunday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for August the 20th. Today, before I can talk about what we're going to be reading today, remember how I said yesterday that, man, on my schedule, I should have put chapters 16 and 17 together. And I said, I wish I would have thought about that. Maybe I should have, but we're just going to do 16 today. Well, come to find out, whenever I was putting together the schedule, I did have chapter 16 and 17 together, at least on the latest version of my schedule. I had chapter 16 and 17 together, but somehow that did not make its way onto my weekly slides, which I use to guide the schedule for the week. So today we're going to make up for that by doing 17 and 18 together. It would have been much better to do 16 and 17 together, but we will make do with doing chapter 17, 18 together. Go ahead and finish up the David and Absalom saga here within this text, going back to chapter 11, where we had the David and Bathsheba story and how that really morphed and evolved into the issues that we see here with Absalom. We're going to go ahead and finish that out today by reading chapters 17, 18 together. A long read, so let's go ahead and get to it. Let's get up on the screen and get to reading in this text so we can see how this unfortunate chapter in David's life comes to a close. So reading together here in chapter 17 of 2 Samuel, verse number 1. Remember, kind of have a bad chapter break here, and you have to go back to see that at the end of chapter 16, that the advice of Ahithophel, the advice of Ahithophel gave in those days, that advice was like someone asking about a word from God. Such was the regard that both David and Absalom had for Ahithophel's advice. So basically, he was very wise. Nobody questioned his judgment. If he spoke, then it's almost as if God had given that wisdom himself. So with that in mind, we check out chapter 17 and verse number 1. That Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will set out in pursuit of David tonight. I will attack him while he is weary and discourage him, and while he is weary and discouraged, throw him into a panic, and all the people with him will scatter. I will strike down only the king, and bring all the people back to you. When everyone returns except the man you're looking for, all the people will be at peace." This proposal seemed right to Absalom and all the elders of Israel. Remember, because he's such a wise man, his words are like they're coming from God himself. Then Absalom said, "Summon Hushai the Archite. Also, let's hear what he has to say." So Hushai came to Absalom, and Absalom told him, "Ahithophel offered this proposal. Should we carry out his proposal? If not, what do you say?" Hushai replied to Absalom, "The advice Ahithophel has given this time is not good." Hushai continued, "You know your father and his men. They are warriors and are desperate like a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Your father is an experienced soldier who won't spend the night with the people. He's probably already hiding in one of the caves or some other place. If some of our troops fall first, someone is sure to hear and say, 'There's been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.' Then even a brave man with the heart of a lion will lose heart, because all Israel knows that your father and the valiant men with him are warriors. Instead, I advise that all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand by the sea, be gathered to you, and that you personally go into battle. Then we will attack David wherever we find him, and we will descend on him like dew on the ground. Not even one will be left, neither he or any of the men with him. If he retreats to some city, all Israel will bring ropes to the city, and we will drag its stones into the valley until not even a pebble can be found there. Since Yahweh had decreed that Ahithophel's good advice be undermined in order to bring about Absalom's ruin, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, 'The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than Ahithophel's advice.' Hushai then told the priests Zadok and Abiathar, 'This is what Ahithophel advised Absalom and the elders of Israel, and this is what I advised. Now send someone quickly and tell David, don't spend the night at the wilderness ford, but be sure to cross over the Jordan, or the king and all the people with him will be devoured.' Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying in Rogel. There was where a servant girl would come and pass along information to them. They in turn would go and inform King David, because they dared not be seen entering the city. However, a young man did see them and informed Absalom. So the two left quickly and came to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. Then his wife took the cover, placed it over the mouth of the well, and scattered grain on it so nobody would know anything. Absalom's servant came to the woman at the house and asked, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" Well, they passed by toward the water, the woman replied to them, and the men searched but did not find them. So they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, Ahimaaz and Jonathan climbed out of the well and went and informed King David. They told him, "Get up and immediately ford the river, for Ahithophel has given the advice against you, or has given this advice against you." So David and all the people with him got up and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, there was no one who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel realized that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey, set out for his house in his hometown. He set his house in order and hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. David had arrived at Mahanaim by the time Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Now Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in Joab's place. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra, the Israelite. Ithra had married Abigail, daughter of Nahash. Abigail was the sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother, and Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, Machir, son of Amiel, from Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogalim, brought beds, basins, and pottery items. They also brought wheat, barley, flour, roasted grain, beans, lentils, honeys, curds, sheep, goats, and cheese from the herd for David and the people with him to eat. They had reasoned the people must be hungry, exhausted, and thirsty in the wilderness. David, while they're in Mahanaim, David reviewed his troops. This is 2 Samuel chapter 18, and appointed the commanders of thousands and of hundreds over them. He then sent out the troops, a third under Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai of Gath. The king said to the troops, "I must also march out with you." "You must not go," the people pleaded. "If we have to flee, they will not pay attention to any of us. Even if half of us die, they will not pay any attention to us because you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better if you support us from the city. Therefore, it is better for you to support us from the city." And then understood there, rather than go out. Verse number 4, "I will do whatever you think is best." The king replied to them. So he stood beside the city gates while the troops marched out by hundreds and thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, "Treat the young man Absalom gently for my sake." For the people heard the king's orders to all the commanders about Absalom. Then David's forces marched into the field to engage Israel in battle, which took place in the forest of Ephraim. Israel's army was defeated by David's soldiers, and the slaughter there was vast that day, 20,000 dead. The battle spread over the entire area, and that day the forest claimed more people than the sword. Absalom was riding on his mule when he happened to meet David's soldiers. When the mule went under the tangled branches of a large oak tree, Absalom's head was caught fast in the tree. The mule under him kept going, so he was suspended in the air. One of the men saw him and informed Joab. He said, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." "You just saw him?" Joab exclaimed. "Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? I would have given you 10 silver pieces and a belt," meaning a promotion. The man replied to Joab, "Even if I had the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For we heard the king command you, Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for me. If I had jeopardized my own life and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have abandoned me." Joab said, "I'm not going to waste my time with you." He then took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them into Absalom's chest. While Absalom was still alive in the oak tree, 10 young men who were Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Joab blew the ram's horn, and the troops broke off their pursuit of Israel because Joab restrained them. They took Absalom, threw him into a large pit in the forest, and raised a huge mound of stones over him. And all Israel fled, each to his tent. When he was alive, Absalom had taken a pillar and raised it up for himself in the king's valley, since he thought, I have no son to preserve the memory of my name. So he named the pillar after himself, and it is still called Absalom's monument today. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, let me run and tell the king the good news that Yahweh has vindicated him by freeing him from his enemies. Joab replied to him, you are not the man to take good news today. You may do it another day, but today you aren't taking good news, because the king's son is dead. Joab then said to a Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed to Joab and took off running. However, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, persisted and said to Joab, no matter what, please let me also run behind the Cushite. Joab replied, my son, why do you want to run since you won't get a reward? No matter what, I want to run. Then run, Joab said to him. So Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushites. David was sitting between the city gates when the watchman went up to the roof of the city gate and over the wall. The watchman looked out and saw a man running alone. He called out and told the king, and the king said, if he's alone, he bears good news. As the first runner came closer, the watchman saw another man running. He called out to the gatekeeper, look, another man is running alone. This one is also bringing good news, said the king. The watchman said, the way the first man runs looks to me like the way Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, runs. Well, this is a good man. He comes with good news, the king commented. Ahimaaz called out to the king, all is well, and paid homage to the king with his face to the ground. He continued, blessed be Yahweh, your God. He delivered up the men who rebelled against you, against my lord the king. The king asked, is the young man Absalom all right? Ahimaaz replied, when Joab sent the king's servants and your servants, I saw a great disturbance, but I don't know what it was. The king said, move aside and stand here. So he stood to one side. Just then the Cushite came and said, my lord, the king, hear the good news. Yahweh has vindicated you today by freeing you from all who rise against you. The king asked the Cushite, is the young man Absalom all right? The Cushite replied, I wish that the enemies of my lord the king, along with all who rise up against you with evil intent, would become like that young man. The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber above the city gate and wept. As he walked, he cried, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son. And that is 1 Samuel chapters 17 and 18. All right, so let's see what we have going on in this text here today. Remember, at the end of chapter 16, Ahithophel has given advice to Absalom and that he needs to take David's concubines and he needs to have sex with them. Some would even deem what he is doing as raping them, since they don't belong to him. And since they probably have no loyalty to him, he would have to force himself upon them in this situation. And that's advice that he gives to Absalom for it to be a sign to the people that he has superseded David, that he has usurped not just his throne, but even taken his own women for himself, taken, the greatest of counselors for himself. He is the new David. This is the advice that Ahithophel gives to Absalom at the end of chapter 16. He continues on in chapter 17 by saying, here's my next bit of advice. Let me and 12,000 men go and find David and kill David alone. And basically saying there's no need for us to kill anyone else. We just need to kill David. And if we can kill David, then everyone will be reunited under you. Because right now, of course, people are torn. Some are pro-David, some are pro-Absalom. But if we can kill David, then everyone's going to be united under you. And want to note that the plan here is for Ahithophel himself to be the one to go and lead this army against David. Not for Absalom to do it, but for Ahithophel to do it. And this honestly seems like a pretty good plan. This seems like a plan that would be successful and lead to the best outcome. Again, the main one being killed and as many others as possible being spared. At this point, verse 4, this seems good to Absalom and to the other elders of Israel, but he still calls Hushai, who remember is David's plant within Absalom's council. He's the secret agent man who's here within this story, and he asks Hushai, what do you think of Ahithophel's plan? And Hushai says, not very good. This time it's not very good, because remember, we read at the end of chapter 16, whenever Ahithophel spoke, people took it as if it was the very words of God. He says instead, what Hushai does is he plays on two things. Number one, he plays on what Absalom knows about his father David, that he is a mighty warrior. He plays on that. But then secondly, what he plays on is Absalom's pride. You don't really want Ahithophel to be the one to lead the army out. You need to be the one to lead the army out. You need to be the one who's going to go and be in front of everyone and showing yourself as being this great king. People think your father's a great warrior. Why don't you show that you too are a great warrior? Now, we have no indication whatsoever that Absalom is actually a great warrior. We don't know that. And maybe just the way he's behaved so far in the story, he's more of a pretty boy, someone who's more concerned with optics than substance. So we don't really know if this would be good or not. But if he could do this, if he would be the one leading him out, then Hushai says that this would then make a greater impact upon the people. Now, remember, going back to chapter 15 and verse 31, remember that David prayed that Ahithophel's counsel would be turned into foolishness. And it seems that is connected to what we find here in chapter 17, verse 14, because it says that that Absalom and his elders listened to Hushai instead of Ahithophel, and it credits that to God. Verse 14, since Yahweh had decreed that Ahithophel's good advice be undermined in order to bring about Absalom's ruin, Absalom and all the men of Israel said the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than Ahithophel's advice. So here we have both human action and the divine will of God playing together at the same time, and showing itself to be very, very present within this particular story. Now, another aspect of this, we're going to zoom out from Absalom and zoom back into to David's camp and to what he has going on. Remember that Zadok and Abiathar, and then pretty sure it is just Zadok and Abiathar. They are the ones that are helping with the spying from the priesthood perspective. So they meet with the servant girl who gives them the information. Then they would set out to go meet with David so that they could tell him what's going on. They're in the process of doing this, except this time they are seen by someone. A young man saw them sneaking off. So he tells Absalom that you have some spies that are sneaking off. He sends people after them. They end up going to this this man's home in Baharim, and they hide in the well. They're misdirected by his wife. They would get up and send the people onto David, and they tell him exactly what is going on. They get up and immediately ford the river, for Ahithophel has given this advice against you. So David and all the people with him got up and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, there was no one who had not crossed the Jordan. So at this point, Ahithophel knows that his advice is not given, and he knows that this is not going to work out as well as his advice. He anticipates that this is going to lead actually to Absalom's ruin. So he knows that if that happens, if Absalom is defeated and David comes back to the throne, well, who's he going to go after first? Well, he's going to go after those who most strongly rebelled against him, one of those being Ahithophel. So what he does, he actually commits suicide. He goes to his own home and he kills himself after setting his house in order, and he exits the story at this point. Remember, Ahithophel surely wanted to inflict as much damage upon David as possible. Remember, he is the grandfather of Bathsheba, so more than likely, it is very possible, if not plausible, if not probable, that that he held a strong grudge against David for everything that had happened to his family. But with him not seeing much hope in the situation for himself, he goes ahead and kills himself. At this point, David arrives in Mahanaim, which is going to be his home base for the time being. And the text tells us that there are a number of people who end up coming to David, and actually bringing him supplies and being a blessing to him and his troops in the city of Mahanaim. In chapter 18, we see David securing a battle plan. He's going to divide up his army into three groups, basically. Joab's going to be one commander, Abishai is going to be another, and Atim, the man from Gath, is going to be the third commander. But David mentions that I need to go into battle myself. Again, David's a great warrior. This makes sense, except that the people say, no, you must not go because you're the only one they want. If a bunch of us die, but you survive, that's great. But if you go out and you die and the rest of us are killed or not killed, then it's a total failure. You need to stay here and let us take care of this. And David, he listens to the people. He does that very thing. He ends up staying, but not before he gives a command, not a suggestion, not just some advice, but he gives a command. And that command is treat the young man Absalom gently for my sake. He says this to Joab, to Abishai, to Ittai, but he also says it in the presence of the people. So there are no excuses for this not to happen, or no excuses for his son not to be spared. Now, we can understand why David would say this. This is his son. He loves his son. But we also need to recognize that it was this treating Absalom with kid gloves that really got David into trouble to begin with. The fact that he did not punish his son whenever his son needed punishing for his sin of killing his brother Amnon, which also gets back to the fact that David didn't take care of the sin of Amnon. So, the same very weak parenting that we've seen from David shows up here a little bit once again within this particular part of the story. But at that point, they end up marching. David's forces march out. Absalom's forces march out. Remember, David's back in Mahanaim. Absalom's actually engaged in the battle, and they end up battling in the forest of Ephraim, which apparently is a massive forest, and apparently seems to be a very dangerous forest, because not only was there a great slaughter of Israel's forces, being the forces of Absalom, but the text tells us specifically that the forest claimed more people than the sword. So it was the environment, the battlefield itself, that ended up claiming a lot of lives. And this has puzzled people for a long time. Maybe there was marshes or swamps or really, really deep thickets that existed. Maybe there were pits within the forest that were very dangerous. Maybe it was wild animals that ended up killing soldiers in the forest. We're not exactly sure, except for the fact that there was a great loss of life here in the forest, and the vast majority of those belong to Absalom. Now, Absalom is riding along on his own donkey, which again, that's just a funny visual to think of. And he runs into some troops of David. Well, he takes off, obviously spurs his donkey on to take off. And while they're running through the forest, the text tells us that as the donkey is running, the Absalom ends up getting stuck. Now his head gets stuck in some low-hanging branches of a large oak tree. Now, many people believe, based on what is written previously about Absalom's luscious locks, about his very nice head of hair, that very, very possibly that his hair is what has gotten caught within these low-hanging branches. So he is suspended there in the air by his hair, and just completely vulnerable to those who might come across him, which ends up being a young man, or one of the men, sees Absalom hanging, tells Joab that, hey, I just saw Absalom stuck hanging by his hair or his head from the tree. And Joab says, well, why didn't you kill him right then? I would have given you silver, and I also would have given you a belt, which more than likely means I would have given you a promotion. But notice what the man says. The soldier listened to David's command about Absalom and obeyed that command. I heard what the king said. The king said that we're not supposed to kill him, that we're supposed to treat him gently. But Joab doesn't care. Joab is so loyal to David that it is truly to a fault. He is more concerned with David's kingship than he is with David's commands themselves. So he says, forget you. You're not of any use to me. I'm not going to waste any more time with you. He takes 3 spears, drives them in to Absalom's chest, and his 10 armor bearers go and strike Absalom down and finish him off as well. They end up tossing him in a pit and make a makeshift grave with stones over top of that. Now, we look at verse 18, we see again just the vanity of Absalom here, and the fact that he had no sons. So he ends up raising a pillar for himself in the King's Valley. And the text tells us that he named it for himself. That is Absalom's monument. And as of the writing of 2 Samuel, it was still around for people to consider. At this point, now news needs to get back to David. And Ahimaaz, he wants to be the one to take the good news to David. But Joab recognizes it's not good news. David's not going to be happy that his son is dead. So no, you're not going to take this, Ahimaaz. I want to send this foreigner, this Cushite, to go take this news to David. But Ahimaaz, for whatever reason, just really, really wants to go. He bugs Joab. Joab ends up letting him go. He beats the Cushite over to Mahanaim, and he approaches David and he says, well, what's going on? He says, great news that the Yahweh has delivered the king from his enemies. And David, they go back and forth between Ahimaaz saying this, and then David asking this continued question, but what about Absalom? What about him? Is he all right? They go back and forth. Finally, the Cushite shows up, and he asks him, what about Absalom? And the Cushite says that Yahweh, or he says the same thing. He asks me, what about Absalom? And he says, I wish that the enemies of the Lord my king, along with all who rise up against you with evil intent, would become like that young man. Well, that to David is not what he wanted to hear, but is what he needed to hear, because it was a status update of Absalom. And he knows by the way the Cushite says this, that his son is dead. And at this point, David is overcome by emotion. He was deeply moved, goes up to the chamber above the city gate, and he weeps. As he walked, he cried, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son. I wonder if what has really overcome David here is guilt. I wonder if that's really what's going on here. Does David feel guilty because of his contribution to this sad saga? Does he feel guilt about Bathsheba? Does he feel guilt about his poor parenting and not holding his children accountable for their sins? Is that why David is so overcome with emotion here in this moment? It is. I mean, while there are so many high mountaintop moments in the story of David and in his life, there are certainly a few very low valley points. He certainly had enough material that could inspire the 23rd Psalm that he is attributed to writing. And how sad it is that this great king, the man after God's own heart, had to endure these sad situations as a result of his failures, as a result of his own sin. So at the end of chapter 18, we close this chapter of David's life, unfortunate chapter concerning his son Absalom. And yet we'll see in chapter 19 tomorrow what's going to happen once the kingdom is restored to David. Joab's an interesting character. He really is not scared to speak his mind. He's going to do such. He's going to do that here in the text. He's going to rebuke David, in fact, for the way that David is behaving. And we'll see what happens with that. We're going to see him running back into Mephibosheth. Remember, Ziba said that Mephibosheth had betrayed David. Does that remain the case? We're going to see that in the chapter here tomorrow as well. So we'll be reading in chapter 19 tomorrow. If you have any questions or comments about this text, I hope that you will please leave those in the comments section below. Really looking forward to seeing everybody at our Bible study and our worship assembly here in a little bit. As a reminder, in our worship assembly, for my part of the worship assembly, as we open our Bibles to study, we're going to be looking at the story of Nicodemus, kind of tracing what I term his journey of faith, beginning with great curiosity and growing, I think, into a faith that's willing to sacrifice for Jesus. We'll see that in the text tomorrow. Hey, again, I hope that we'll have a great day together. And I do, again, hope that you'll join tomorrow as we read together in chapter 19. Have a great rest of your Sunday, everyone. God bless you and all that you do. Hope you'll see us again tomorrow as we continue our read through 2 Samuel chapter 19. Take care and God bless.